Thank you very much. First of all, thank you all for inviting me. I'm flattered. I've been among you in the past, as some of you will remember. I remember those as wonderful experiences, so I'm very glad to be able to do it again. I do have to begin, as I often do, by reminding you that my function is to bring the message to you. And you must remember the old slogan, do not shoot the messenger because you don't like the message. I did not create what I'm about to tell you about, but I have the obligation to tell it to you as I see it. If it is disturbing, you all know that you can go back to the radio and the television and you'll get much more comforting analyses of what's going on than what I'm going to have to give you now. Let me also begin with the end. I don't believe that we are in a situation that we can't change. I don't believe that radical, deep social change is beyond us. None of that. But I am a realist, and if we're going to win, then we got to know, as the host said so eloquently, we got to know what we are dealing with. And because I only have the 25 minutes, I'm going to focus on the big things. And then in the Q&A, we can go into whatever details you are interested in exploring. Okay, so starting with the big things. Because of a decision made by all of your parents, you are here, and it is now. And you are therefore confronted with living under conditions you did not create, nor did you choose. So what I'm about to tell you is not your fault, but it is your reality. The history of the world, before and since capitalism, has witnessed long periods of time when one particular nation or tribe or group or clan was dominant in an area that had several other tribes, groups, clans, nations. That is not unique to our time. Every single one of those, which as a shorthand, we can give their current name, empire, every one of those old empires is precisely old because we know it disappeared. These empires were born, they evolved over time, and then they died and passed away. Sometimes to be replaced by another empire, sometimes to be replaced by shorter or longer periods of time when no particular nation was dominant. Now to get right to the present. The 18th and 19th centuries were centuries in which the beginnings of modern capitalism happened in England and enabled the English to have a faster economic growth than was happening in other parts of the world to which capitalism had not yet come. And the British, as they developed their capitalist system, took advantage of what it gave them in the way of textile production. England began to produce the textiles that all of us wear to this day. And that gave them an enormous power in the world. They also developed ways of producing armaments, which allowed them to force their way into every corner of the world. And so the 18th and 19th centuries were the periods in which the British Empire ruled the world, as much of it as they could. It was still too early to literally rule the whole world. That's not even possible yet, although we're closer to it. But the British were very proud of what they had as a slogan, that the sun never sets on a territory that isn't part of the British Empire. But eventually, as happened to all empires, the British Empire declined. It declined partly because it was too difficult to deal with all of the chaos they created, all of the opposition they created, including, by the way, one corner of their empire, what later came to be called the United States, which rebelled against continuing as a part of that empire, and comparable rebellions happened all the time. They didn't all end up with an independence, although eventually pretty much they all did, but for a while the United States was one of the early ones to break away. And as if there weren't enough trouble of rebellion within, there were other nations that wanted to break the British Empire monopoly and tried very hard, particularly in the 19th century. And the two contestants were the United States, and the other one was Germany. And those were the two who began to develop Germany after it became a unified country under Bismarck, and the United States after it became a unified country by means of the Civil War. And they gave Britain a run for its money. Britain fought against them militarily, economically, politically, culturally. The United States had to fight 2 wars with Britain to gain its independence. The first one in 1775-6 that you all celebrate on the 4th of July, and then another war, because the Britain didn't like losing the first one. The War of 1812 was the second time the British tried to squash the effort to be independent, but it failed. And keep this in mind, it failed. The British could not stop the competition from the new rising capitalist power, the United States on the one hand, Germany on the other. And eventually, this process was decided by fighting a war, World War I. They had come close to wars before, but World War I was a struggle between Britain, Germany, and the United States. Others were involved, but those were the 3 key players. And out of it came the destruction of Germany. It was now pushed out of the contest by being defeated. And as you probably know, and if not, you might want to look into it, the defeat of Germany traumatized that population. And for the next 10 years, they flirted with socialists in their government, which they had never dreamed of doing before. The United States came out on top, and the British were fatally wounded. They, quote unquote, won the war, but they lost their empire. Please keep that theme in your mind as well. You can win the war and lose your empire. The British Empire is completely gone in the 20th century. It is dead. It was mostly killed off in World War I, but the little bit that remained was finished off in World War II, as was the effort of Germany to come back from its World War I defeat under the leadership of a fascist who wanted to make Germany great again. Trump's slogan wasn't even original. The 20th century, therefore, was the emergence of the next empire. The collapse of the British Empire was the development of the American Empire. You can date it whenever you want, give or take 100 years of empire, roughly 1870 to 1970. An extraordinary period. No other economic entity in the world came close to what the United States became and was over this time. It was an explosion of capitalist profitability, capitalist economic growth, and capitalist global expansion. After World War II, the old empires, British, French, Dutch, were all swept away and replaced by the American empire, either officially or unofficially. But everybody understood. And for the last 100 years, US capitalism, the system you live in and you confront, had an extraordinary run. Remarkable growth, remarkable expansion, remarkable taking over the empires from the past. It allowed the United States until 1970 to experience an absolutely unequaled kind of capitalist growth, in which the working class's standard of living rose every decade, even in the 1930s. And profits rose even more. The capitalist class celebrated its rising profits. The working class celebrated its rising standard of living. And the ideologues who work in the university and the media could develop the notion that something exceptional was true about the United States. The religious people made the story simple. God just likes us better than everybody else. Because no other capitalist country at that time could experience all of that. And it went to the heads of the American people. A socialist movement that had focused on raising the standard of living found itself with a lot of work to do because the system enabled the standard of living to be raised. It had to be fought for. Unions had to fight hard, socialists, communists, all of them had to fight hard. But they could be given a rising standard of living because the system was working. Please keep that in your mind as well. What happened by the 1970s is that everything changed. And the change, if I have time, I'll later be glad to go into it. But I'm to make it very, very simple and condensed. The 100 years of successful capitalism, coupled together with the 100 years of hard class struggle that really put the capitalists in the country up against it, who then used their rising profits to give the working class, resenting every step of it, a rising standard of living. By the 1970s, it meant that here in the United States, the wages were higher in real terms than anywhere else in the world, and the capitalists were grousing about how they could have made even more profits if only they could do something to take back what the working class had won. And then they found two ways to do that. And in the 1970s and ever since, they've done that. The first one was to buy and pay for and sustain technological changes that enabled machines to replace workers. The first one was the computer, literally a product of the 1970s in terms of its commercial availability, followed by robots, and followed now by artificial intelligence, which is a continuum. A dramatic ability to throw millions of people out of work, forcing them to compete with those still working by offering their labor at a lower wage. And the second thing they did at the same time was to relocate jobs out of the United States, to go to those parts of the world that they had not been able to use up until that time, because the jet engine, another development of the 1970s, together with the internet, made it possible to control and supervise a factory in Shanghai as easily as in Cincinnati, with the result that you now all know, a tremendous explosion of capitalist investment, but not in the United States. The very industries based here moved, and they moved to China, and they moved to India, and they moved to Brazil. The combination of jobs leaving to go elsewhere and jobs disappearing because you were replaced by machinery, by computers, meant that suddenly the relationship between capital and labor in the United States changed. The capitalists didn't need large chunks of the American labor force, and they were skilled in using that to press down the wages. And here's what happened. Since 1970s, real wages in the United States have gone nowhere. After a century of rising every decade, they stopped. If I had time, I would explain to you that if you raise the incomes and wages of a working class for a century and then you suddenly stop, it's like withdrawal for a drug addict. It's a traumatic experience. It would have been one for the United States, but they came up with methadone to replace heroin. Methadone in the economic language is credit. In the 1970s, credit card for everybody. Never had that before. Automobiles purchased on time. College educations purchased on time. Credit, credit, credit. We would have had a collapse in this country in the 1970 period, but for the credit, and everything that has been sustained in the American economy since then is based on credit. We sit on an economic system very vulnerable because it is so dependent on credit. And for those of you who enjoy the richness of capitalist exploitation, at least as something to understand, where did the money come from that the mass of the American people were suddenly able to borrow with their credit card and their college education loan and all the rest? The answer is from the profits that accrued to the capitalists because they stopped paying more wages. The wages didn't go up anymore. Meanwhile, the technology made them produce more and more. So they took a portion of the big profits they earned after the 70s and lent them to the workers. From their point of view, what they were able to do was to stop paying workers higher wages and to instead give them a loan, which the worker would have to pay back, plus interest. No wonder the United States has had a good 30 to 40 years. The working class has been drowning in ever more debt, its underlying wages unable to keep up, and the profits have gone crazy. But the flip side, and remember, Marx was a student of Hegel, and the opposites are always lurking. The flip side of this, very important, was that the capitalists themselves moved. They moved the center of activity, the growth, the expansion, not in the United States, which was busy playing credit games, but to China. You know, there's an old joke that capitalists will sell to the workers the ropes that the workers will use to hang them. And they'll make a profit on that sale, even though it might be their last. The Chinese phenomena has been to take the capitalist class from its old centers of growth, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, and bring them voluntarily to relocate in China. So that in the last 30 years, the Chinese economy has exploded relative to every other place in the world. 50 years ago, China was one of the poorest countries on earth. Today, China is the #1 competitor to the United States. No other country, in my memory and in the records of history, has ever done anything like that in so short a time. Over the last 30 years, just so you understand, the growth of China as an economy has averaged 3 times faster than the United States. The United States has averaged 2 to 3% growth per year, and the Chinese 6 to 9. Even the last 3 years, China is way ahead of the United States. During the pandemic, after the pandemic, it doesn't seem to matter. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to go even faster. This is a new experience for the United States. Its economy isn't growing. Somebody else's is. The ability to hold on to the pressures and the rebellions in the empire is becoming less and less. I know what I'm about to say is sometimes difficult for American audiences, but for the rest of the world, it isn't difficult to see. The perception around the world is that after World War II, the United States can't cope. It lost the war in Korea. It lost the war in Vietnam. It lost the war in Iraq. It lost the war in Afghanistan. I could go on, but you get the picture. This is not the way an empire is supposed to work. And when it's rising, that isn't how it works. The United States is an empire that has passed its peak. If there's anything I want to get across, that's the context in which you have to understand what it is now doing. It is getting desperate because this has been going on now since the 1970s, so upwards of 40 plus years, and there's no end in sight. The powerhouse in the world of economics is now China. That's the reality. This is still the richest country, but all the dynamic, all the growth is in China. They've even surpassed the United States in the highest of high techs. TikTok is a Chinese operation, not an American one, and so on and so on. And now we get to the final things, because I want to bring it as much as I can home. When an empire goes down, it gets desperate. It looks around, and this has happened every time. What can we use to slow our decline? What can we do to reverse it, to regain our youth, our ability to grow? How do we bring back what we had in the 20th century? The United States doesn't have the wealth anymore it once did. The rest of the world has caught up. They can't use their economic power. It doesn't work. It used to. It did in the 20th century. It just doesn't now. And if you want, we can talk about it. But the best example is, if you understand what's going on in Ukraine, there are 2 wars. There's one on the ground between Russian and Ukrainian troops. That's not important, except, of course, to the people who live there, for whom it is horrible. But there's a second war, led by the United States, which is called a sanction war, an attempt to squash Russia. And why? Because Russia is a major ally of China, which is the main issue here. So you fight a sanction war. You cut off the market for Russia's oil and gas that they live off. You take $300 billion. It just seized it. that is the backing for their currency. You close the international systems of insurance and money. They can't function in the world. It was called in Washington the mother of all sanctions. It was to bring Russia to its knees. It is, just so you understand, 100% failure. It did not work. Russia has found others to sell oil and gas to. Russia has found others to invest in the country. It is an inability to do what you used to be able to do, which makes it dangerous because you can then turn to the one area where the United States still is dominant, and that is in the area of military. But you don't need me to tell you where that can go. When an empire goes down, all the people in that empire begin, whether they're conscious of it or not, to think in terms of how to save myself. The French have a lovely saying, sauve qui peut. And the closest in English, it's everybody for themselves. The rich use their power and their wealth to hold on as the system breaks down. The rich and the powerful offload the costs of a declining empire onto everyone else. And that's what's going on in the United States today. One of the reasons, not the only one, and you know this better than I do, but one of the reasons you're seeing the labor militancy in the United States take off, particularly over the last couple of years, is because of the accumulation of what I've tried to summarize. The squeeze at every turn in the conditions of your work, in the benefits you do or don't get. Everybody is squeezing to hold on as the ship goes down. Most of the countries of the world are staying out of the Ukraine war. They're continuing to do business with Russia and China and India and Brazil. The position of the US dollar is a pale shadow of what it once was 50 or 75 years ago. Okay. The working class has been taking it on the chin for 40 years of redistribution of wealth when its wages stopped going up, but the profits kept going up because it became more and more productive. And they're angry and they're bitter. And then you hit them with a 1, 2, 3 punch, a pandemic and a crash associated with that, 2020. Before you're even done with that, an inflation. And before you're done with that, rising interest rates. You cannot expect to wallop a working class on the scale that we have done in this country without watching bizarre, weird, strange, angry, bitter responses. Let me give you a historical parallel and then I'll stop. The German working class was one of the most advanced, developed, organized, and socialist in the world across the 19th century. It's not an accident that Marx was German. He came out of that, and that came out of his work too. By the end of the century, Germany was contesting with Britain to be the next empire. And the German working class had produced organization no other socialist movement had what they had in Germany. The workers' schools, the workers' universities, an endless production of Marxist theorists that we still read today. And if you weren't German, you went to Germany to be part of it, like Rosa Luxemburg and folks like that. And then, in very short order, the German working class was smashed. Number one, Germany lost World War I. That was not supposed to happen. They were supposed to be the successor empire after Britain. Instead, they were totally wiped out. If you know the history, the death rate in World War I has never been equaled since. Unbelievably destructive, particularly of Germany. The war was over 1918. 5 years later, 1923, Germany had the worst inflation in modern history. In a period of 9 months, the value of the German Deutschmark, is what it was called then, went from 4 or 5 to a US dollar to 6 billion Deutschmark to a dollar. Prices doubled every 2 hours. You can't even imagine that. Overnight, the savings that German families, notable for their frugality, had accumulated for generations, held in little boxes under the bed. All that money that grandpa and grandma had scrimped and saved would be enough to buy you, if you were lucky, a quarter pound of butter. Wiped out. And 5 years after that, in 1929, the Great Depression hits. You can't hit a working class with the expectations they had on the one hand, and then 3 destructive blows. Of course, they went a little crazy. Half of them voted communist and socialist in the 1932 election. And the other half went with Adolf Hitler. And the German industry made a choice, which we all know which way to go. We are experiencing what we should recognize as an equivalent earthquake coming out of the way capitalism evolved here in the United States and in relation to the rest of the world. Over the last 2 days, my final point, over the last 2 days, there were meetings. I don't know how many of you follow this, in Ramstein in Germany. The ostensible issue was the rest of the world, the United States and Western Europe, to put the squeeze on Germany to send tanks in large numbers to the Ukrainians. The Germans have now said, no, I'm not doing it. Why? Well, when I give you the answer, which you will not find, at least not yet in the US press, although it's in Europe, when I give you the answer, you'll understand. The German capitalist class has told the German government, if you do this, you'll be out of there in 20 minutes. Why? Because the German capitalists are the ones who are the ones most hurt by the Ukraine war. They have been the dominant economy in Europe for one reason, not the bullshit that Germans are engineering whizzes or have a personality that's, none of that. German dominance depended on one thing, cheap energy from Russia. That's why they bought it from Russia. That's why Russia sold it to them. When the war breaks out, they don't get cheap energy. And energy goes into the price of everything Germany produces. Germany is an export-dependent country, one of the most export-dependent in the world. But the prices of everything it's going to charge for its exports goes up because they have to pay for the energy. They don't want any of this. And they're not going to escalate the war. And the speculation in and among the German capitalists is, you know, this is a war declared between the United States and Russia, but they're both willing to sacrifice Germany. Okay, we can play the game too. The war in Ukraine comes to an end. Germany and Russia work together to resume the very profitable relationship they had before this war. And that would mean that China and Russia and Germany begin to come together. And that is the end of the American empire. We are much closer to all of that than is admitted. Everything I have said to you is documentable. I don't make this stuff up. I'm just a messenger. But you live in a society that is suffering from something every psychologist recognizes. It's one thing to have a trauma of any kind, but it's much worse if the trauma is denied, if you don't talk about what happened to you with other people to try to work your way out of it. Trying to hold on, denying that the empire is shrinking, denying that we finally have a real competitor economically. I will conclude with one statistic, then I promise to stop. Because it's a statistic which, if you keep it in your mind, will prevent you from making mistakes. The Soviet Union was never an economic competitor of the United States. Never came close. Russia is not an economic competitor of the United States. We have a statistic in economics called GDP, Gross Domestic Product. It's roughly a measure of the output of goods and services in one calendar year. And by knowing that, you know whether an economy is big or small. So what is the GDP of a country versus another country? Gives you a sense of their relative size. For the most recent year, the GDP of Russia, $1.5 trillion. That's the GDP of Russia. What is the most recent GDP of the United States? $21 trillion. Do you understand? Russia is David. We are Goliath. There's nothing comparable. Italy has a bigger GDP than Russia does. In China, the GDP right now is roughly $17.5 trillion. That's a competitor. Russia is a small adjunct to the competitor. The problem of the United States is that it has a declining empire and a declining economy, and China's is going the other way. Nothing I have said should be understood. I'm not endorsing China or celebrating it. None of that. That's another question. But not to understand what's really going on here and who the players are and what's happening is to make major mistakes. American industries are going to have rough going in the years ahead. There are too many powerful forces arrayed against them. And they're going to turn on the working class here the way they always have when they've been in difficulty. And you're going to hear all kinds of commentary. The way to deal with this inflation, which is another redistribution of wealth, we are told is raising interest rates. That's a lie. That's not a question of theory. We are told it must be done. It must be done. The Republicans say so. The Democrats say so. Biden says so. Trump, when he wakes up, says so. What difference? But the answer is no, no, no. That hurts poor and middle income people and small businesses if you raise interest rates. Is there another way? Of course there is. Nixon in 1971 declared a wage price freeze. On the 15th of August, the president speaks to the American people and says, any business that raises a price of anything that they produce or sell, as of tomorrow morning, if you raise the price, I don't care how much, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in jail. The inflation stopped on a dime. The remarkable thing is you live in a country. What I just described was a conservative Republican president's act. And we live in a country where no one discusses doing that and what the pros and cons were. Nope, that's a country that is becoming dictatorial, but not because we've lost our commitment to civil liberties. When did we have one? It's because the conditions are getting harder And when the conditions get harder, the harshness of the regime has to come into play. And so we are all told what they want us to hear while we watch as those at the top hold on to as much as they can, and the rest of us pay the price of a declining empire that refuses to admit to anyone else, but above all itself, what that means. And the real question for the American people now is whether this declining capitalism, whether you are going to let it take you down with it. England thought it could win back the independence of the United States, tried 2 wars, lost them both, and gave up. Is the United States going to go to war with China twice before it learns history's marched on? Can't do that anymore. With nuclear weapons, that's a very scary proposition. I took more time. I know, I apologize. On the other hand, you would want to hear the whole story because it's more than you might get even if you listen to CBS News this evening. Thank you. Thank you.